Since it's the holiday season when this is dropping, I thought I'd make a video about a Christmas classic. It's about a young boy left on his own in a big house, having to fend off intruders using a series of whimsical pranks. It's a dark, gritty film, extremely gory and sad, and very, very French. That's right, I'm talking about 365 Code Père Noël, also known as Dial Code Santa Claus. This outright horror movie was released 1 year before Home Alone, also known as Maman, j'ai raté l'avion, and bears a striking resemblance. The first time I watched Dial Code, I thought, well, certainly somebody has done the legwork to figure out how two such similar movies came out in such rapid succession. René Manzer, the writer-director of Dial Code, seems to feel strongly that Home Alone ripped off his movie. He even threatened 20th Century Fox with legal action, although I can't find evidence that a lawsuit actually happened. A ton of articles have referenced the similarities, but I couldn't find any that actually attempted to solve this mystery. And I was like, oh well, we'll never know. I'll never know. But I couldn't let it go. So today we'll figure out how two movies about children fighting off home invasions using toys at Christmas were released within a year of each other. It's a phenomenon called twin films. It's not common, but it's not unheard of for two bizarrely similar movies to be released in a short span of time. You can find a whole list on Wikipedia, although at the time I'm recording this script, Dial Code and Home Alone are not on it. I reviewed this list to get a better idea of what causes twin films, and I've broken them down into 5 general categories. Coincidences. The Fly and The Wasp Woman are both horror movies where people turn into insects using science. That feels like a pretty weak overlap, and they don't actually have a lot of similarities beyond that. In the 1950s, about 1 billion giant insect horror movies were released, so this feels like an evolution of that. Enough people make movies, there's bound to be overlap. Industry hijinks. Movies are not made in a vacuum, and it's actually a pretty small industry of people working with or against each other. Probably the funniest example is Ants/A Bug's Life, 2 ant-based animated films released in 1998. This is a great example of a twin film because obviously these two movies were uniquely similar. It's generally believed that DreamWorks stole the idea for Ants from Pixar because A Bug's Life was already well into production when Ants was pitched. This became the source of a big feud between the studios. Now that's what I call making a mountain out of an anthill. After the success of Night of the Living Dead, George A. Romero and John A. Russo split the franchise in 2. Romero took the Blank of the Dead title structure, and Russo took the Living Dead phrasing. So it's not surprising that Day of the Dead and Return of the Living Dead both came out the same year. Other than being about zombies, they're nothing alike in tone or subject matter. From a modern perspective, it feels like a stretch to call them twin films. But then this was a time when there were so few zombie movies, it was remarkable that 2 were released in a year. Imagine! But that leads me to my next category. Industry trends. The Equalizer and John Wick are on this list because they are about a competent old man protagonist who seeks vengeance through killing. That's true, and in the absence of other information, it might seem like a compelling through line. Except both of them were made after Taken and are part of a general revival in hyper-violent old guy vengeance stories, the dadification of action films. The Street Fighter Mortal Kombat Double Dragon triple header is another great example of an industry trend. Studios around that time were looking for the same kind of project, a martial arts-based video game to adapt, and they found them. You'll also notice that no superhero flicks are on this list. As a modern audience, we wouldn't conceive of Marvel DC movies as being twin films, because we understand that that's just the current trend. Nothing noteworthy is happening here. That's also the case for these video game movies, but because this list was compiled by a modern audience, that trend is less visible. So does it stop being a twin film or triplet film or more just because it's a trend in movies at the time? Do I need to differentiate between twin films and trends in general? Do I have time to investigate this question more? No, Merry Christmas! Real life events. Whether a literal adaptation or just inspired by, you can expect movies to come out based on real events after a few years' delay. So there's no mystery why a bunch of Vietnam War movies came out in the late 80s. A decade after the war ended, books had been written, turned into scripts, produced into movies. And do y'all remember when those 2 documentaries about the Fyre Fest came out the same week in early 2019 and it was really confusing to talk about? Yeah. Category 5 is genuinely just weird. The Adventures of Wong Fu, Queen of Julie Newmar are about a group of 3 people, mainly composed of drag queens, on a road trip. I actually thought these were the same movie for the longest time. That drag queen road trip movie with Guy Pearce and Wesley Snipes and Hugo Weaving and John Leguizamo, what an all-star cast! Based on a very light amount of research, I can't find any explanation of how this happened, but that's a lot of unusual flavors to hit in one movie, especially in the mid-90s. Weird is the category that drives me wild. Weird is the category that keeps me up at night. Because any movies that are in the weird category might actually, secretly, be in one of the other categories. And the only way I could find out is if I spent a ton of time and energy researching it to find an answer. And if I didn't find an answer, it might mean that there is no answer, or simply no answer that I could find. Thankfully, that's not the case today. If I made these 5 categories into a circular spectrum graph, I would put weird and coincidence really close to each other. What differentiates them from each other in my mind is the amount of overlap in the movies. So like 2 movies about dysfunctional families at Thanksgiving feels like coincidence because that's a common trope about holidays. But it feels weird that 2 monster movies set in caves came out in 2005. And I think I could find an answer on that one, but I'm not. We're focusing. So, which of these categories does Dial Code and Home Alone fall into? The easiest to eliminate is real life. Manzoor has said he was partially inspired by his son's waning belief in Santa Claus. In fact, Dial Code's child star was actually his son. Similarly, John Hughes, who wrote Home Alone, has said he was inspired by his own son. Inspiration struck while he was packing for a family trip. He thought, what if I left my 10-year-old son at home? And then sat down and wrote 8 pages. More than that, if both of these people were inspired by the same news event, the incident would have had to have been 1, big enough to receive international attention, and 2, small enough to disappear from the collective consciousness. Because if Home Alone were based on something, you know there would be 100 articles and videos about it. And every YouTuber who made a video about it, their thumbnail would be that, oh, face. Oh shit, that should be the thumbnail for this video. So I'm removing that one. The next category I wanted to investigate was industry hijinks, because that is the one I would have bet all of the presents under my tree was the cause of this twinning. Remember, these movies came out really close to each other, so there was a chance I could eliminate this category entirely if production on Home Alone started before Dial Code was released. Dial Code opened in January 1990 in France and evidently only aired for a single week. Principal photography on Home Alone started in February 1990. So it looks like this one's all buttoned up. Let me go ahead and remove that one. But, like a lot of horror movies, Dial Code ran on the festival circuit before it ever got a broad opening. And one of the places that it ran was Cannes in May of 1989, long before principal photography started in Home Alone. Cannes was and is widely attended by American filmmakers, and it's possible that someone connected to Home Alone was there and saw the movie. Haha. So there's no roster of who attended Cannes in 1989, so I can't make a list and check it twice. But remember when I said John Hughes was inspired to write Home Alone while he was packing for a trip? Well, that trip was to France. This oral history by James Hughes said that his father wrote 8 pages of notes that would become Home Alone on August 8th, 1989. That's a very precise date. John Hughes was known for always having a notebook on hand, so whether he dated this page or James figured it out based on the timeline of the trip, I think it's probably accurate. James refers to this trip as the first family trip to Europe. There is no evidence to suggest that John Hughes took an earlier solo trip to Cannes. Now, arguably, James Hughes is a biased source of information. He has an important stake in John Hughes's legacy. But this article was released in 2015, which is before Dial Code's first release in the US in 2018. There's no reason for him to misrepresent the date here, unless he knew about and wanted to cover up a 3-decade-old beef with an obscure French horror film, and that feels really unlikely to me. I mean, who would waste their fucking time? Fundamentally, I don't think John Hughes would go to France and watch an obscure horror movie and think to rip it off. He was a very prolific screenwriter, and he didn't need to take inspiration from other movies. If industry hijinks were at play, at most it might be somebody he worked with saw Dial Code at Cannes and mentioned it to him in passing, and then the idea wormed into his brain apple, but again, really no evidence of any such thing. But August 8th does put the Home Alone start date after Dial Code had premiered at an international festival, so I just don't feel like I can entirely eliminate industry hijinks as a possibility, although I am marking it extremely unlikely. So, let's consider industry trends. Christmas holiday and holiday horror weren't as popular in the 80s as they are now, but there was precedent. Silent Night, Deadly Night, released in 1984, featured a creepy killer in Santa clothes. There was also a French Christmas dark comedy, Le Père Noël et Intruders, released in 1982, that featured a rowdy Santa Claus and might have provided inspiration. Manzer was clearly inspired by American action films like First Blood, and a lot of the style of Dial Code is in keeping with industry trends, even if the Christmas setting was still unique. Weirdly, holiday movies were a trend for John Hughes personally. By the time Home Alone released, he had a reputation for two things: youth-centric movies and holiday classics. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles in 1987 and National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation in 1989. So prolific! So a youth-centric holiday movie is a natural extension of what he was already doing. I'm gonna wrap that 3 times, because I think it's that big. Hughes had recently directed Macaulay Culkin in Uncle Buck, and people involved in Home Alone suspect he had him in mind when he wrote the script. Hughes would also go on to write other similar kid vehicles, none as successful as Home Alone, but then again, very few films have ever been as successful as Home Alone. And I found this article where Time magazine identifies Home Alone as part of a larger Hollywood trend of kid-centric media, alongside Look Who's Talking and Bart Simpson. Both writers said they drew from their actual experience as parents, at a time when a lot of movies were made about children. So there is strong precedent to suggest Manzer and Hughes just had the same idea at the same time, the media form of convergent evolution. I marked trends down as the slightly more likely option while still being very difficult to prove. And then I sat down and I wrote this script and I thought I was done. Then this book that I ordered from the library finally arrived. It was lighter on production details than I was hoping, but there was a surprising anecdote that I hadn't found anywhere else. On a family vacation when John Hughes was a child, his mother left him by the side of the road after he threw a tantrum. She returned in short order, and they continued on their way, and it was all fine. But John Hughes didn't really have a spontaneous thought of what if we accidentally left one of the kids at home, so much as he unearthed a childhood memory of being left by the side of the road and turned it into one of the biggest box office comedies of all time. My childhood memories have never done anything for me. This left me with very little doubt that actually Dial Code and Home Alone are just a combination of industry trends and being fucking weird. I never actually expected to find anything even approaching an answer to this 30-year-old mystery. I thought it would be a video about me struggling and then coming to some sort of terms with my desire for answers that can't be fulfilled. But I was way more successful than I had anticipated. So I've learned nothing. This is for real this time. Thank you for watching this fun, for at least for me, mysterious exploration of Dial Code and Home Alone, 2 great movies that I highly recommend watching this season. And an extra special thank you to Alice Lee, Danielle Welch, and Lloyd Weldy for saving my life when I was attacked by a man dressed as the Easter Bunny. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few jaws. 'Cause of Easter eggs? Is that too far? If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, consider supporting me on Patreon, patreon.com/thejenna. There you'll find secret, hidden, bonus videos that are usually themed according to whatever the main feed video is. So like last month was my Cowboy Bebop video, and I made a episode by episode breakdown of Cowboy Bebop, the Netflix live action show. This month, it'll be a guide to seasonal holiday winter horror movies, of which I'm very fond of many. Patrons also get to know ahead of time what topics I'm going to be covering, and some of them even get to vote to decide what my next video will be. The January video is one I've been thinking about for kind of a couple of months, so I'm really excited to get to break into that. And they already know what that is. And you can too, by joining patreon.com/thejenna. Happy winter holidays! I might be good at researching.